He was falling from the sky into hell, and yet his mind was still. In September of 1965, a jet exploded over North Vietnam. A veteran Navy pilot, Commander James Stockdale, was ejected mid-air, parachuting straight into enemy territory. His fate was almost certain: capture, torture, humiliation, possibly death. But in the seconds before he hit the ground, Stockdale didn't pray, he didn't scream, he didn't think of his family or his past. He focused on a single idea, a line from an ancient slave philosopher named Epictetus, a line that would become his shield, his sword, his survival. Epictetus reminded us, the chief task in life is simply this: to separate matters. Tell yourself what belongs to you and what does not. While most men would panic, Stockdale made two mental declarations. First, I am leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. Second, I will be here for 5 years. At the very least, there was no denial, no false optimism, just pure, brutal acceptance, and yet an iron will to endure. This wasn't just discipline, this was philosophy in motion, the kind of philosophy forged not in classrooms but in cages. A mental armor worn by warriors, emperors, and yes, by men suspended mid-air with no control over where they'll land. Stockdale had studied philosophy at Stanford, but Epictetus wasn't just a topic of study for him. It was a survival manual, a weapon. His captors would try to break his body, but they would never conquer his mind. Modern author and Navy SEAL Jocko Willink captured this same mindset, perhaps unknowingly, in 3 words that echo Stoic clarity. Jocko Willink teaches, relax, look at the problem, solve it. That's exactly what Stockdale did. His problem was captivity. His solution was philosophy. Welcome to the Stoic Lighthouse, where ancient wisdom illuminates the darkness of modern life. If this light resonates with you, let it guide your journey. Tap like, subscribe, and join us as we step into the fire and emerge unbroken. Today, we unpack the mental survival kit of James Stockdale. What he carried with him wasn't visible. It had no weight, but it made him stronger than steel, because when everything else was taken from him, this was all he had left. And it was all he needed. Are you ready? Let's begin. Number 1. The first act of Defiance, the dichotomy of control in action. When Stockdale hit the ground, it wasn't soldiers who greeted him. It was a mob. Civilians, angry, shouting, violent, descended upon him with fists and boots. They shattered his leg, dislocated his shoulder, dragged him to the infamous prison the Americans sarcastically nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. But what followed wasn't just physical torture. It was something more insidious, psychological warfare designed to humiliate, degrade, and dismantle a man's identity. Stockdale wasn't just any prisoner. He was the highest-ranking naval officer captured in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese wanted to use him as a propaganda tool, parade him in front of cameras, make him confess, break his will in front of the world. Most men would have collapsed under that kind of pressure, but Stockdale didn't. He remembered the core teaching of Epictetus and applied it with terrifying precision. Epictetus warned, some things are up to us and some are not. He couldn't control the mob. He couldn't control his broken body or the interrogations ahead. But there was one thing he still owned, his usefulness to his captors. That was his line in the sand. And so, in a move that would seem mad to anyone unfamiliar with Stoicism, Stockdale did something unthinkable. Alone in his cell, he grabbed a wooden stool and smashed his own knee over and over until his patella was destroyed, until he could no longer stand, let alone walk. Why? Because they needed a healthy prisoner to put on camera. He gave them something else. A man so broken physically he couldn't be used as a puppet, but spiritually, he was untouchable. This wasn't self-destruction, it was self-command. A brutal, calculated move to exercise power over the only thing left in his control, his own body. And in that moment, he turned his body into a weapon. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the midst of war, echoed the same truth almost 2,000 years before. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Stockdale saw the propaganda campaign not as a final defeat, but as his first battlefield. He transformed pain into resistance, humiliation into defiance. He turned what was supposed to be the beginning of his unraveling into his first moral victory. This principle of choosing where to place your energy, of zeroing in only on what you can actually change, is echoed by modern thinkers as well. In his best-selling book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***, Mark Manson cuts through the noise of modern anxiety with a simple truth. If you try to care about everything, you end up controlling nothing. Focus instead on what's within your grasp. Mark Manson might say it like this: Stockdale picked his battle and won it before it began. And that's the lesson for us. You may not be in a prison camp, but maybe you're trapped in a toxic workplace, a painful relationship, a body that's failing you. In these moments, the world will tempt you to focus on what's unfair, on what you can't change. But the Stoic path, the Stockdale path, asks a different question. What small part of this is still yours? Maybe it's your attitude. Maybe it's the next words you choose. Maybe it's your willingness to take a walk instead of spiraling on the couch. Freedom isn't the absence of limits. It's the mastery of what remains inside them. Number 2, the inner citadel, separating pain from suffering. The walls of the Hanoi Hilton weren't just built of stone. They were built to collapse minds, to squeeze the soul into silence. In those dark cells, James Stockdale faced beatings, starvation, and isolation that would break most men. The guards rotated torture methods, sleep deprivation, dislocation, whippings, and above all, solitary confinement, total sensory deprivation for months. The goal was simple: crush the will, shatter the identity, make the prisoner forget who he is. But Stockdale understood something the guards didn't. They could touch his body, but they could never enter his mind unless he let them. And so, behind those cement walls, he began building something stronger, invisible, impenetrable, a fortress of thought. The Stoics called it the inner citadel. According to the ancient philosophy, there is a clear line between pain and suffering. Pain is a physical event. Suffering is the story you wrap around it. One is real, the other is optional. Seneca reminded us, a man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. Stockdale trained himself to face each moment of pain as a fact, not a personal attack, not a reason to spiral into self-pity. He didn't ask, why me? He asked, what now? Moment by moment, breath by breath, he learned to accept pain and refuse suffering. He taught this mindset to his fellow prisoners. When one of them would return from a brutal interrogation, barely able to walk, barely able to speak, Stockdale wouldn't offer sympathy. He'd offer clarity. He'd remind them, what happened to your body is real. What happens next in your mind, that's your domain. Modern psychology has caught up with this ancient wisdom. In the field of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, therapists teach patients to observe their thoughts and feelings without judgment, to create distance from pain, to choose action based on values, not emotions. Donald Robertson, psychotherapist and scholar of Stoicism, describes it like this. Donald Robertson explains, the Stoics practiced a kind of cognitive distancing, learning to see their own impressions and judgments as separate from themselves, something they could examine and question. For Stockdale, that meant this: they could injure his body, but they'd never get his consent to break his soul. He refused to tell himself a victim's story. He chose a warrior's story instead. And here's where it hits home for us. You may not face whips or starvation, but you will face pain, rejection, failure, loss, the pain of being overlooked, the pain of not feeling enough. These are real, but what do you build on top of them? A narrative of defeat or a discipline of resilience? Stockdale's inner citadel wasn't built in comfort, it was built in hell, but once it stood, it sheltered him from everything that came after. That's what we're called to build, not a fantasy of control, but a fortress of self-possession. Because once your mind is yours, the world has nothing left to take. Number 3. The Soulsmith, turning shame and fear into tools. The war inside the Hanoi Hilton was never just physical, it was psychological. Every blow, every threat, every sleepless night, it all aimed at one thing: your sense of identity. Stockdale and his fellow POWs weren't just tortured for information, they were humiliated, degraded, forced to kneel before their captors, pressured to sign false confessions, filmed denouncing their country, each act designed to corrode their honor and make them betray who they were. Many broke, and that wasn't weakness. It was biology. Humans break. Under enough stress, anyone can yield. But what happened after that moment, that's where the real test began. Stockdale understood something rare. Shame in the Stoic framework isn't the enemy. It's a signal, a compass, a call to return to your values. He refused to let shame bury him. Instead, he turned it into fuel. Aristotle taught, anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not easy. Stockdale applied this exact reasoning to shame. He didn't drown in it. He studied it. He asked, what does this emotion say about what I value? Where have I strayed from my code, and how do I return to it right now? He taught this to the other prisoners. After a confession or a forced statement, they used a secret tapping system to communicate through the walls. Not just strategy, but empathy. They told each other, it's okay. You bent, now come back. We move forward. This wasn't denial, it was alchemy. What Stockdale did was transmute shame into strength. He showed his men how to use their most painful emotions, fear, guilt, disgrace, as tools instead of chains. Modern researcher Brené Brown, though not a Stoic, echoes this with her powerful work on vulnerability and resilience. Brené Brown teaches, shame cannot survive being spoken. It cannot survive empathy. Stockdale's prison walls became a forge, and he became a soulsmith. With every whisper, every coded knock, he helped shape men who would not only survive but emerge sharpened by fire. He turned fear into alertness, shame into alignment, regret into resolve. The lesson here is piercing, because we too are faced with shame, all the time. The shame of not being enough, of making a mistake, of letting someone down, and our reflex is to hide, to isolate, to let it fester. But the Stoic path calls us to do the opposite, to face it, to interrogate it, and to use it as a guide. So ask yourself, what am I ashamed of? What does that reveal about who I want to be? And how can I act differently, right now, to reclaim my direction? This is how a man becomes stronger, not by avoiding fire, but by stepping into it, hammer in hand, and forging himself anew. Number 4. Duty and leadership. The Philosopher-Guardian's burden. James Stockdale didn't volunteer to be the highest-ranking prisoner at the Hanoi Hilton. He didn't ask for command. But philosophy, real philosophy, doesn't wait for comfort. It answers the call of circumstance, and that call came loud and clear. As the senior officer, Stockdale held the moral center of an entire community of suffering men. Alone, any one of them might break. But together, with the right structure, the right guidance, they could endure the unendurable. His duty wasn't just survival, it was leadership, and not the title-driven leadership of the military rank. This was moral leadership, Stoic leadership. Plato once warned, the penalty for refusing to participate in politics is to be ruled by someone worse than yourself. Stockdale understood this truth. If he didn't lead, someone else would. and without vision, without integrity, that leadership could collapse under pressure. So he stepped into the role of what Plato called the Philosopher-Guardian, the one who leads, not out of ambition, but out of responsibility. He established a code of conduct for all prisoners, a North Star to guide them through chaos, simple, memorable, and morally sound. A code that said, never confess to crimes you didn't commit, never allow yourself to be paraded, hold unity above self, resist in ways both big and small. But leadership isn't just words, it's connection. In a place designed to sever communication, Stockdale helped create a secret lifeline, the TAP code. Using a matrix of 5x5 letters, the prisoners could speak through walls by tapping. They shared news, encouragement, warnings, support. One man alone in a cell could still feel part of something larger. He was never entirely alone. That changed everything. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, what is not good for the beehive cannot be good for the bee. That was Stockdale's mindset. He was a bee, broken, bruised, but still protecting the hive. His suffering had a purpose, to keep the whole alive. This is where Stoicism meets service, where virtue meets obligation, where the inner citadel extends into the outer world. For a Stoic, your role in the world is sacred. Whether you're a father, a CEO, a janitor, or a prisoner of war, you have duties, you have a mission, and how you perform it defines your character. Modern voices like Jordan Peterson, though often controversial, echo this ancient wisdom. He speaks often about bearing responsibility, about putting your life in order before criticizing the world. Jordan Peterson says, pick up the heaviest thing you can carry and carry it. Stockdale didn't just carry his pain, he carried the collective pain of dozens of men. He became the spine they leaned on, the compass they turned to, the guardian who refused to break. And that's the lesson for us. We live in a world obsessed with individualism, with finding yourself. But maybe your purpose isn't found by looking inward. Maybe it's revealed by who you serve, by what you're willing to protect, by how far you're willing to go to do what is right, even when no one is watching. So ask yourself, what role has life placed you in? And are you showing up for it and fully? Because the greatest kind of strength isn't about you, it's about who stands taller because you didn't fall. Number 5. The breaking point. Sacrifice as the final weapon. By 1969, James Stockdale had been in captivity for 4 long years. Torture, starvation, solitary confinement. He had endured it all. But now, the enemy had something new planned. Something bigger than pain. They were organizing a major propaganda event, a staged parade of American POWs, filmed, broadcast, designed to show the world that the prisoners had surrendered, broken, and turned against their own country. And they wanted James Stockdale at the front of that parade. Their prize, their puppet, their proof. But Stockdale knew what was at stake. This wasn't about him anymore. If the men saw their leader marched in shame, their resistance might collapse. Their hope might die. The line between order and chaos would blur. He had to stop it, even if it meant going beyond anything he had done before. He had one weapon left, and it wasn't philosophy. It was sacrifice. Chrysippus, one of the founding minds of Stoicism, taught, virtue is a kind of health, a harmony of the soul, and nothing should be valued above it. Stockdale understood this at his core. His body, his reputation, even his future. All of it was disposable compared to one thing: honor, virtue, integrity. And so, the night before the scheduled filming, he acted. Using a hidden razor, Stockdale cut into his scalp and face, disfiguring himself so he'd be unfit for the camera. Then, as if that weren't enough, he used a stool to beat himself further, swelling his face, darkening his eyes, transforming himself into something unusable for their narrative. The next morning, when the guards found him, they panicked. The event was cancelled. The message was clear: you can break my bones, But I choose what breaks my spirit. This wasn't recklessness. It wasn't suicidal. It was the ultimate act of power inside a powerless place. A man claiming absolute sovereignty over the only battlefield he still controlled, his own body. Seneca once wrote, "Fire tests gold, adversity tests the strong." Stockdale was in the fire, and every time the heat rose, he answered with clarity, not fear, with action, not despair. He saw his body as an indifferent, in Stoic terms, something not essential to virtue, something that could be sacrificed if necessary, in service of the greater good. And here's where the lesson becomes personal. In our own lives, we may not be beaten, but we are tempted constantly to trade away our integrity for approval, for convenience, for status, and each time we compromise, even slightly, we lose a piece of ourselves. Kevin Vost, a modern Stoic thinker and psychologist, put it simply. Dr. Kevin Vost reminds us, virtue is the only true good. Everything else can and must be sacrificed, if needed, to preserve it. Real. So here's the question. What are you willing to sacrifice for your values? Where is your line? And what do you refuse to compromise, even if the world demands it? We often think strength is about dominance, but true power, true sovereignty, is the ability to say, you can take everything from me, except the right to choose what I stand for. Number 6. The Stockdale Paradox. The Anatomy of Real Hope. After 7.5 years of captivity, 4 of them in solitary confinement, and more than 20 documented sessions of torture, James Stockdale finally returned home in 1973. He stepped off the plane a broken man in body, but stronger than ever in spirit. He received the Medal of Honor, tributes poured in, he was called a hero, but in private he remained a philosopher, and he had one final lesson to share. Years later, business author Jim Collins interviewed Stockdale for his best-selling book, Good to Great. He wanted to know how certain people and organizations survive when others collapse. And he asked a question Stockdale had heard before. Who didn't make it out? Stockdale didn't hesitate. His answer was as sharp as it was unexpected. Oh, that's easy. The optimists. Collins was stunned. How could optimism be a death sentence? Stockdale explained. The optimists were the ones who said, we'll be out by Christmas. Then Christmas came and went, then Easter, then Thanksgiving, then Christmas again. Each missed hope broke them further, until finally they gave up. James Stockdale taught, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. This is the Stockdale paradox. It's the ability to hold 2 truths at once. First, an unshakable belief that you will prevail. Second, a cold, brutal honesty about where you are now. Most people choose one or the other. Some drown in despair, others hide in delusion. But the ones who survive, who lead, who endure, they live in the space between. That's where real resilience is forged. Seneca, who knew suffering well, reminded us, he who anticipates the blow softens its force. This is why, when Stockdale parachuted from the sky, he told himself, I'll be here 5 years at least. He wasn't being negative. He was being prepared. He refused to be surprised by suffering, because surprise is the assassin of endurance. Modern Stoic philosopher William B. Irvine expands on this mindset with clarity. William B. Irvine explains, Stoicism is not about eliminating emotions. It's about eliminating the destructive ones, like the disappointment that comes from unrealistic expectations. And this insight is revolutionary, especially today. In a world addicted to toxic positivity, where you're told to manifest your success and expect only good things, the Stockdale paradox stands as a hard-won truth. Life will not go as planned. You will be tested. Your hopes will be delayed, maybe even denied. But that doesn't mean you stop hoping. It means you hope smarter. You root your optimism not in fantasy but in discipline. You believe in your victory, yes, but you do the work. You face the pain. You look directly at your prison, whatever form it takes. This is real hope. Not sugar-coated, not fragile, but forged through suffering, through fire, through truth. So when life corners you, when your plans crumble, when it feels like the sky is falling, don't pretend it's all okay. Don't lie to yourself. Instead, say what Stockdale said, "I will prevail, but I know exactly where I stand today, and I'm not afraid to look at it." That's not just stoicism, that's survival, that's strength, that's wisdom. James Stockdale's story isn't just a story of war. It's not just about medals, torture, or even resistance. It's a manual for the human soul, a mirror that reflects the question we all avoid. When the world takes everything from you, who are you really? His captors tried to take everything, his freedom, his body, his voice. But they couldn't touch his mind. They couldn't breach his philosophy. They couldn't rewrite the code he had carved into his very being, because he had already done the work. Long before the prison, long before the pain, he had chosen who he would be, when it mattered most, and that's the invitation Stoicism gives to each of us. You don't need to wait for disaster to begin. You don't need to fall from the sky. Your battle may not be fought in a jungle prison. It may be in your office, in your home, in your mind. The question remains the same. Are you prepared to face it? Epictetus reminded us, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Let's remember what Stockdale carried with him, not in his hands, but in his heart. These were the weapons that kept him whole, the dichotomy of control that freed him to act when others froze, the inner citadel that shielded him from suffering even as pain raged on. The power to transform shame, using his lowest moments as fuel for higher virtue. The unshakable sense of duty, not for himself, but for the collective. The willingness to sacrifice body and comfort for honor. And finally, the Stockdale paradox, the blueprint for real, unshatterable hope. He was beaten, starved, broken in body, but never in spirit. Because what defines a man is not what happens to him. It's what he chooses to become when it does. So now it's your turn. Which of these principles resonated with you most? Which one do you know you need to practice? Starting now? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters, and your story might be the one that strengthens someone else today. If this video brought you clarity or courage, help us spread that strength. Like the video, subscribe to the Stoic Lighthouse. Share this with someone who needs to remember that even in darkness, philosophy can be the flame. And if you think this story was powerful, wait until you hear what's coming next. In our next video, we'll travel further back to a man who lost everything in a single day. His ship, his fortune, his reputation. Standing among the wreckage, he could have crumbled, but instead he created something immortal, a new way of thinking, a new way of living, a philosophy that would shape emperors, warriors, and survivors for over 2,000 years. We'll tell the story of Zeno, the man who was destroyed by fate and responded by founding Stoicism itself. Don't miss it. Until then, remember, you don't need ideal conditions to become who you're meant to be. You just need resolve and the courage to live by a code, even when no one is watching. Because when the battle comes, and it always comes, philosophy isn't a luxury, it's your only armor. Stay strong, stay grounded, and let the light guide you. See you in the next video.